Cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST. Today we're doing one of my favorite noodle dishes, which is a crispy beef chow fun, which is going to be done sort of in the style of a Mongolian beef. We're going to be taking a few liberties today. We're going to be talking about all of those things too. So we're going to be diving into, well, basically what we're going to be following is a recipe that came out over on my YouTube channel a couple of months ago now. I think that was back in like March or April. Quite a while ago now, I guess. So we're going to be diving into all of that. We're also going to be taking a second to talk a little bit about working with fresh chow fun and all of the crazy shit that comes up when you are working with fresh chow fun, because it is a very, very finicky type of noodle, as anyone who has ever worked with those noodles will tell you, because they're really, really delicate. They're also very, very pantry or very, very fresh, which means that anytime that you're working with something that's that fresh, they can go stale really quickly, which also means that even if you do get them really, really fresh, they could also still kind of start coming apart if you don't treat them properly. So we're going to be talking about all of that stuff. So if you have any questions for me, feel free and drop your questions in the chat. I don't know everything about beef chow fun, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative, at the very least entertaining to watch. As always, if you're looking for the recipe video, that already lives over on my YouTube channel. So that's at youtube.com/woocancook. So if you're watching on Reddit, that'd be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the channel you're already on. Lots of new stuff coming out over there every Friday. So this Friday coming up, we've got a recipe coming out for a string bean chicken, which is going to be really fun. And is loosely inspired by the version that you would find at Panda Express. But I took quite a few liberties with that particular recipe. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely make your way over to the YouTube channel. We got a lot of fun stuff coming up. Okay, so kicking things off as with pretty much every stir fry that I do. That was 4 cloves of garlic, which I just finished crushing and mincing. Thank you. And then next up, what I'm doing right now is this is our ginger root, which if you were watching a second ago, I just picked it off of a much larger piece of ginger root. Which is always interesting, because what's so difficult about ginger is that it grows in a very, very odd shape, because it's a root. So it grows in the shape of the root, which can go in any kind of different direction. So what's tricky about ginger is that it makes it that particular shape that it's in makes it very difficult to measure, because depending on like how that thing is measured, it's hard to say exactly how much ginger you need, because it kind of like grows in weird knobby directions and shapes and all kinds of stuff going on. So what I usually say is what we're looking for is about half, or about an inch's worth of ginger, which should look something like this. And if you're still not clear about it, usually what I will say, or what is definitely pretty accurate, is that we need to measure about a tablespoon of ginger as it's minced up. So once it becomes a fine mince, we're looking for about a tablespoon, which is obviously not super helpful if you're trying to figure out how much to start mincing. But you get better at it over time. Generally just eyeballing it, I guess. If you don't like doing minces, you can also, I actually have recently discovered that you could toss this into a food processor that will work really well. We do that in the food booths. We do that in the food pop-ups when we're working with really large quantities of ginger. So when we're like trying to fine mince like 3 pounds of ginger, we'll do it in the food processor. We'll just toss all of it into a food processor and it gets pretty similar results. With something like, with such a small quantity of ginger like this though, I find that you definitely don't need to do that. So what we're doing is we're just giving this a quick mince and setting this aside. And these are going to be, you will very often see me refer to these as the aromatics of our recipe for the specific purpose that they are aromatic. We're looking for the aromatic qualities that derive from them. So we're going to throw them into our wok very first and then bloom them for their fragrant qualities. Which is always done best when added to the wok very, very early, while the wok is relatively empty, because we've got lots of hot oil to bloom those aromatic qualities out. Without that hot oil, what you'll end up with is probably just like burnt or sometimes steamed ginger, which is not great. Okay, so next up is the only other veggie in our dish today, which is some baby bok choy. So as you can see, you can kind of see. Baby bok choy, it's slightly smaller, not a lot smaller, but very slightly smaller, or definitely noticeably smaller than your regular sized full-grown bok choy. You'll also notice that if you've ever worked with full-grown bok choy, it's a slightly different color. Full-grown bok choy is like a darker shade of green here on the stalk bit. And those full-grown bok choys, they usually are like a little bit more bitter and a little bit more chewy than baby bok choy. So pretty much any time that I work with bok choy, definitely any time that I'm working within a stir fry with other things in it, you will probably see me using baby bok choy. It's always been my preference because it's a little bit less chewy and definitely a lot less bitter. But if you are particularly preferential to full-grown bok choy, you can absolutely use that stuff. Probably my favorite part about full-grown or baby bok choy is that there's a lot less work to do because it's much smaller. So what we're going to do right now, or what we're doing right now, is basically just chopping these in half. Some of them are a little bit larger, so I'm going to go into quarters. But mainly we're just trying to chop them in half and get them into manageable bites. And that's going to be about it. If we were working with full-grown bok choy, we would have to do a lot more chopping. And then one more. I'm kind of eyeballing this, but what we're looking for is about like 10-12 ounces of baby bok choy. What we're looking for is something like this. This kind of looks like a lot of bok choy, but remember that anytime that you're working with a leafy green, especially things like bok choy, also things like spinach or lettuce or anything like that, is that they're going to lose a lot of volume once they get into heat, because all of the leafy portions of the veggie are going to start wilting. So there's our bok choy, and as with any time that we're washing a vegetable, especially when we're washing it in the sink and it's got all of this water coming out, it's very, very important that we shake out all of this water, or as much of it as we can. And you will hear me say this about pretty much every veggie that we wash, is that after you finish washing, this is also true for anything that is wet. I do this with firm tofu a lot too. Is that we need to shake out all of this water because we want to make sure that water doesn't end up into our wok, because if it does, it's going to contribute to bringing the temperature of the wok down. And that's going to be a significant problem as we try and keep our wok very, very hot, because as the wok fills up with water and moisture, then we start getting into this world of developing really, really mushy stir fries, because the wok is struggling to stay hot because it's exerting all of its energy to burn off all of that water instead of cook. So before you go and put that stuff into a bowl like I just did, make sure that we shake off as much of that water as we can. Alright, so that's our bok choy, and that's actually it for veggies. So next up, we're going to dive into our flank steak, which I have flank steak finally, so we're going to be working with flank steak. In the last couple of recipes, and definitely the last several live streams that we've done, I have been working with substitutions for flank steak because I haven't been able to find flank steak in a while. I don't know why. But here's our flank steak. What's very useful about flank steak, I like it a little bit more than I like top cut sirloin, which is kind of the equivalent, is that the grains of your flank steak are very, very apparent. Our flank steak is running in this direction, which is very useful because when we're working with a really, really lean cut of meat like this, we want to be careful to chop against the grain of the meat as much as possible. So you'll notice what I just did is I did one very, very long cut with the grain. And then the rest of our chops are going to be against the grain. So we're going to go in this direction for the remainder of the things that we cut, the remainder of our chops for the rest of this flank steak. So the reason that we're doing that is so that we can develop the most tender piece of steak that we can manage. So by making sure that we chop against the grain, what that does is it makes sure that once you bite into that piece of steak, you're biting into the most parallel pieces of steak, or the grain is biting parallel so that you don't get really, really chewy steak. That's particularly important when you're working with something really, really lean like flank steak because flank steak is already, doesn't have a lot of fat to it, which means that it's going to be very chewy already. So we're actually going to be doing a couple of things to make sure that this steak stays nice and tender. So the main thing, part of that effort, what we're doing is chopping against the grain. But the other very, very important aspect that we're going to do today is a technique that you will often see referred to as velveteen. And essentially what we're going to be doing is dropping this steak in a little bit of baking soda, about a 1/4 teaspoon. And that's going to help develop this nice crispy piece of steak that's not going to be too chewy. And is actually a technique that you will see come up in a lot of Chinese food. It's probably how most beef in most Chinese stir fries are done, is with a little bit of baking soda. Lots of times I will also skip that step because I'm lazy, but if you are really committed to getting a nice tender piece of steak, do the velveteen step. It's real nice. So there's our steak. Whoops. Okay, let's wash up our cutting board. We're done chopping too, actually. Not too much to chop today. I don't always remember to do this, but generally when I'm working, as you work sort of like veggies and meats into your workflow, I generally try and make sure that we chop our meats last. That tends to be very useful because you don't have to keep washing your cutting board. If we chop the meats first, then we would have to clean it after chopping the meats and then clean it again after chopping the veggies, which is really, really annoying. So do your best to remember to try and do those meats last. Which is a little bit counterproductive because if you are trying to do marinades, it's nice to get your marinade going while you're doing your veggies, but compromises, you know? All right, so next up, this is gonna be our baking soda. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm going to combine, this is gonna be about 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. With a little bit of water. So the quantity of water is not super important. What's a lot more important is that we combine this really, really thoroughly and that we dissolve our baking soda so that we don't have any solid clumps of baking soda. And then I'm going to add this to my steak. Try not to spill it. So then what we're going to do here, there's a spoon. So I'm going to give this a quick toss, and this is the technique that you will often see referred to as velveting, And essentially what's going to happen is that baking soda, it's going to start breaking down the proteins in your steak, so that as it sears, the baking soda is going to stop things from searing or binding too quickly. So then what's going to happen is while we sear our steak, we're going to be able to get it nice and crispy without also essentially like burning it. So without developing like chewy qualities to our steak. So that baking soda tends to be really, really useful because it helps us develop this nice piece of steak from a very, very lean cut of beef, like flank steak. Jay is your bro, yeah. Hello. Today we are doing a flank steak-based beef chow fun, which is what we're doing right now. So this is our flank steak, and right now what we're doing is assembling our marinade. So what I like to do when I work with Velveteen techniques is I like to just throw it straight in with the marinade. So if you are really committed, you could do this separately. I see a lot of recipes that will call for doing the Velveteen step, which will take about 30 minutes, so it's got to sit for 30 minutes. Then draining off the baking soda and then doing the marinade next, which will take another 30 minutes. So I personally don't like doing that because I don't want to wait that long. That would take an entire hour to do both the Velveteen and the marinade. So usually what I'll do is I'll combine them both like we're doing right now, and it gets us somewhere similar. What's really, really important about the Velveteen as we combine that baking soda is that we want to remember that the baking soda itself has a very particular taste to it. So if you've ever tasted raw baking soda, or if you've ever worked with baked goods too often, you will know that uncooked baking soda, so baking soda that is remnant and unactivated, what happens is it leaves this very, very metallic taste to it. So as we work with this baking soda, we want to make sure that anything that's remaining after it's done activating and doing its work, it's got to get drained off. It's very important. That's got to come out. It can't get into what you're cooking, because what will happen is that if you let unactivated baking soda get into the stir fry, it's going to leave a very metallic taste to it. Kind of tastes like drinking out of a metal canteen a little bit that's been sitting in the sun. And then it has this weird metallic taste to it, which we don't want. That's real bad. So what I like to do is I like to combine it with our marinade, and then once we drain off the marinade liquid, that remaining baking soda, it's going to come off too. So that's very useful. But very, very important. So all of this liquid that's in our marinade, that's also including all of the liquid from our baking soda. That all has to get drained out before it gets into the wok. Otherwise, it's gonna kind of taste like we're drinking out of a metal nalgene, which is not fun. We don't want that. All right, so that's our marinade. I'm gonna let that combine for, should be ideally about 30 minutes. It's not gonna go for 30 minutes. It'll probably go for about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit less than that. In the meantime, I'm gonna get my sauce going next. So that's 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. This is 2 tablespoons of Shaoxing wine, which is a Chinese cooking wine. If you can't find Shaoxing wine, you can just get dry cooking sherry, and it's going to be essentially the same thing. If you get yourself a really high quality dry cooking sherry, it might even be better than Shaoxing wine, because a lot of Shaoxing wine is really, really cheap junk. Next up, what I'm adding, so this is my favorite combination of dark ingredients. You'll see these come up in a lot of different recipes that I've written. This is 2 tablespoons of black vinegar, dark soy sauce, and then finally oyster sauce. So as you'll come across a lot of recipes that I've written that use dark soy sauce, so things like pad kimao, pad siu, this particular beef chow fun, the lion's head meatballs, lots of stuff like that. You will see these 3 ingredients come up a lot because it's how we develop that dark caramel color to our stir fry. And hopefully we have enough oyster sauce. So I love combining these 3 ingredients quite a bit because they kind of give us that nice color palette. All right. Excuse me, somebody is at my door. Be right back. Where's the marinade? Okay. right. Cool. So here's our marinade. This is getting going. Next up, we're going to finish up our sauce next. What else do we have? Oh yeah. The last thing that we're adding to our sauce today is going to be a bit of doubanjiang, which is a Chinese fermented chili paste. So it's a very, very aggressive form of heat. So when you use doubanjiang, use it very sparingly because it is very, very overpowering. And if you use too much of it, it will absolutely overtake your recipe super quickly. So I always recommend when you use that stuff, go easy and stop and taste as you go. Because it is super easy to overdo it on the doubanjiang. Last up, the last thing that I always recommend is season to taste, usually with kosher salt, but sometimes I adjust with soy sauce. Ooh, that's nice, yeah. I'm gonna add just a little pinch of salt, and I think that's gonna do it. Yeah, that's good. You will see me adding a pinch of salt to a lot of sauce recipes that I do. And that's usually because that comes up a lot. It's not because I like really salty stuff. Well, I do really like salty stuff. But the reason that comes up a lot is because I'm working with low sodium soy sauce, which has a little bit less salt in it. And I love doing that, not because I think it's healthy. It's definitely not healthy. I love doing that because it kind of like gives me a little bit more control over the salt content of the things that I'm cooking. So we can use soy sauce without being too aggressive about it. And you don't really miss out on much. You can just kind of adjust with that salt as you need to. Okay, so next up, this is my Chow Fun rice noodles. So I mentioned this at the start of the stream too, and we can dive into all of the specifics that go into working with fresh Chow Fun. Chow Fun, if you've ever worked with the fresh stuff, is real finicky because it is has to be very, very fresh. So when you're looking for fresh Chow Fun, I mentioned this pretty much any time that we do a recipe with fresh Chow Fun, because I've messed it up so many times. You really, really, really want the fresh stuff. So if you are shopping for fresh Chow Fun and you see it at the counter and you touch it and it kind of feels a little stale or if something feels a little bit off, it's probably not good anymore. And no kidding, this stuff, it will go stale within like 12 to 14 hours of getting to the grocery store. So be very, very careful when you're buying this stuff because if you buy yourself some stale Chow Fun, it's going to be a real bad time. And then essentially what's going to happen if you're working with stale Chow Fun is it's going to end up sort of just like falling apart in your wok fry. So if you've ever had like a pad kimao or a pad siu or beef Chow Fun, where the noodles are just sort of like really, really crumbly, that's what's happening when you're working with Chow Fun that has gone stale. Because you're going to have a lot of trouble keeping together these really, really long, thin and super delicate strands of Chow Fun. So that's what we're doing right now, is kind of just pulling all of these noodles apart, because what we don't want to do is start fracturing these noodles, because then you're going to end up with the same kind of case as you would if you were working with stale Chow Fun. So the other thing that I recommend, or I found works really well, so if you are working with stale Chow Fun, which is not a good place to be in, but if you happen to be there, I've been there for sure. One really great hack that I discovered is that you can just totally just microwave this stuff, and it just will start sort of loosening up. So what that's going to do is it's essentially activating the oil. So you'll notice my hands are covered in oil right now. That's because the Chow Fun is covered in oil. And then once you start microwaving it, it's basically going to start activating that oil. And it's going to start loosening the noodles up a little bit so that you can do this step, which is essentially breaking these noodles apart. If they're stale, you're not going to be able to do this step because they're just going to start breaking apart before you can pull them apart. So that's Chow Fun. I've experimented a lot with Chow Fun, so I can tell you a lot about what's going to happen. I've also discovered that what we really don't want to do, so one thing that I have done many times, is you can absolutely be tempted to just drop all of the noodles straight into the wok, which is really, really tempting because it's all like packaged there nicely already. So it makes you kind of just want to dump a brick of Chow Fun into the wok and just sort of like pray that it comes apart, I guess. But that's never a smart move. Essentially what's going to happen if you do that is you're going to end up with basically a block of beef Chow Fun, which is really gross. So don't do what I did. I messed this up many, many times. Do yourself a favor, make sure that this stuff is fresh before you dive into it. And do yourself a second favor and make sure that you pull these noodles apart before they get into the wok. And then what we're gonna do as we start like rounding out our stir fry is we're gonna add this chow fun about a handful at a time. So we're not gonna just go and dump all of these noodles straight into the wok. We're gonna add it about a handful at a time and then kind of toss things to combine. And then add another handful and then toss, and then another handful, and so on and so forth. So by making sure that we add the chow fun really, really gradually, that does a couple of things. First, it helps us be very, very gentle with the way that we combine the chow fun. But the second thing that it does is it makes sure that things don't start clumping up again, because it will absolutely, even though we just finished pulling these apart, these can absolutely start clumping up again, which is not fun. All right. So over on the stove, I got my wok heating up. We're gonna let this thing get ripping hot, and then we're gonna start searing our beef. If we were really committed, this beef, it should be searing for at least another 10-15 minutes. I don't think this is gonna get a full sear. That's okay though. What's really important though is here at the bottom we will see all of this liquid marinade going on. So that includes a couple of things that's going on at the bottom of that marinade. It includes not just the soy sauce and the brown sugar that we added, but it also has inside of it all of our baking soda. So that baking soda's got to come out. So usually I'll kind of eyeball it, and I'll probably just like work around it and make sure that I don't add that liquid into our wok. Today, I actually do want to be very, very careful about that marinade and make sure that it doesn't end up in our wok. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drain all of this liquid out so you can see it pooling up at the bottom there. And that is going to kind of do part of the work for us. The remainder of what we're going to do is basically just as we start putting this steak into the wok, we're going to be very, very careful that this remaining liquid is not going to get into the wok with it. Well, again, and I mentioned this earlier as well, but the point being is that we're trying to avoid adding baking soda to our stir fry, because that's going to taste like metal, which is not fun. So that's about 4 tablespoons of peanut oil. And then here's our steak. We're going to add this a piece at a time, flat side down, and we're going to sear for 2 minutes. I'm also going to be very careful to make sure that I don't overload my wok here. So this will probably take 2 or maybe 3 batches here altogether. Don't get overeager, don't overfill the wok. What will happen is if you add too many things to the wok at this point, it's going to have a lot of trouble staying hot, and then you're going to end up with like mushy or overcooked beef, which is not good. So we want to make sure that as we sear our beef, that we're searing it as hot as possible. And we do that by making sure that this wok stays nice and hot and not overfilled. There we go. So that's about, as you can see, there's plenty of space in the wok, but that's about as full as I'm going to let it get though. And that's just essentially to make sure that we don't lose heat. So I'm pretty sure this is going to take us 3 batches. So I'm going to let that go for a full 2 minutes before agitating. Yeah. Tattooed dinosaur. Wow, that's a lot of awards. Thank you so much. That's so cool. All seen upvote. I like that one. Cool. So what's really important right now is what I'm going to do is I'm rotating my wok so that that oil that's at the bottom of the wok doesn't just stay settled at the bottom of the wok. What I want it to do is kind of like circulate around all of the beef, because any of that steak that is not touching oil, it's just going to burn, which is not fun. We want to make sure that all of that beef stays nice and oiled. Otherwise, we're going to end up with burnt steak. I'm actually going to try and add a little bit more oil. Unless it's empty. So that's going to go for another minute and change. Yeah. out of oil. Let me refill this. Yeah, hello everyone. Am I African American? I am not. I am Chinese American. Well, I guess technically I'm Taiwanese American. But born and raised here in California, in the Bay Area. That is also why I make so much Chinese food, because that's that's sort of like the cuisine that I'm most comfortable cooking. So I also do a lot of like Japanese and Korean stuff, but most comfortable living in like the Chinese, Taiwanese wok fry, stir fry sort of world. Cool. Where's my oil? Where did I put it? Oh yeah. All right, so I'm gonna get this going, and we're gonna start agitating things here. They are. What I like to do is kind of take a peek at it first, and yeah, that's looking real good. So we can go ahead and give this a toss, and we want to go for that wok. Not quite. If you're trying to get that wok, it is not that important. But ideally what you're trying to do when we're trying to achieve that wok, which is basically when the wok sets on fire, what you need to do is dip the wok a little bit lower so that the open flame of your gas range ignites the oil that's in the wok. So it's not super important. Also, it's kind of dangerous. So I don't recommend doing it, especially if there's a camera directly above your wok. But if that's what you're trying to do, that will work. 5 o'clock Charlie, yeah, hello, thank you. Fellow American, yes. Ooh, the best way to make rice. Yeah, we actually went through a whole spectrum of all of the ways that I know how to make rice in one of the videos that we did recently, which was the Korean gimbap recipe. So we actually got a chance to dive into that. We've also been making a lot of rice. I've been making rice in like massive quantities lately because we've been doing it for the food pop-up where we do fried rice. And I have learned every way possible of making rice. So if you're doing it stovetop, it's real simple. Just equal parts or twice as much water as rice. And then just let it simmer for 15 minutes. Bring the water to boil and then let it simmer for 15 minutes covered. And then let it remove it and then remove the lid and then let it simmer for another 5 minutes. If you're cooking in a rice cooker, what I've always done, so this is a technique that you see lots of like Chinese grandmas do, is what we're trying to do is fill up the pot with rice and then fill up the pot with water up until the point where when your pointer finger touches the surface of the rice, the water level should reach your first knuckle. We call that like the knuckle technique. And it works really well. That's how I've always known how to make rice until pretty recently, at least. The best way of making rice, though, that's a good one. All right, so here's our first batch of steak going, nice and crispy. And then what I'm gonna do is, first thing that I'm gonna do, this is very important when you're batch cooking in a sear, is that you gotta rinse the wok out. So it's very important. It's real tempting to leave it because what's at the bottom of the wok when you finish searing stuff is a whole bunch of fond. So that's what you will see referred to in a lot of like Western recipes as fond. It comes from, I believe, French cooking. I believe it's coming from French cooking. And usually, what you will do in that kind of cuisine is you will see some form of deglazing process where you will like deglaze all of that stuff that's stuck to the bottom of your wok or pot with some kind of liquid, usually with white wine or red wine or something acidic. And that's how you develop sauces. So that's how you develop like gravies and any kind of sauce. That comes from Western cuisine. In Chinese cuisine, I actually have not seen it come up very often in Chinese cuisine. And I feel like the only times that I have seen it come up, I think it's coming from like some sort of westernization of a Chinese recipe. So I actually don't know why it doesn't come up. But the reason that it's very important to wipe down that wok in between batches, though, is because if you are batch cooking on a wok like we are right now, and you leave that stuff sitting, what is going to happen is it's just going to start burning, and you're going to get a bunch of charred stuff, which is not good. Not as much of a problem in other like French and Italian cooking, because you probably are not doing as much batch cooking, so it's not as important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sear these in batches, and on our last batch, I'm going to reserve that fond and save it for our sauce. But we don't want to reserve it for the earlier batches because that stuff is just going to start burning. And you're going to get a bunch of weird charred stuff in your wok fry, which is not good. So in the meantime though, I'm doing the exact same thing. We're just basically repeating here. So I'm adding my steak flat side down in the hot oil. We're trying very hard not to overload our wok. And that ought to do it. So we're going to let that go for another 2 minutes. Yeah. Not wash the rice. Yeah, so what I like to do, I think this is like the general consensus, is that what I usually do is I'll add the rice to a fine mesh strainer and then give it a rinse. And we actually, so I like to link this. There it is. There we go. So that's the recipe that we did for the Korean gimbap. It was a couple of weeks ago. And we ran through all these specifics. And essentially what I like to do is add it to a fine mesh strainer and then give it a rinse. What's happening when you rinse that rice down, it's not like the rice is, well, the rice probably is dirty, but it's not that important. It's not like super dirty. What's most important about when we rinse that rice is when you come across raw rice, it's coated in a bunch of starch. So it's important to rinse that starch off. Otherwise the rice is gonna clump up once it comes out of the wok fry. So that's not the end of the world. It's still totally edible, and I oftentimes will skip that step if I'm feeling really lazy and I don't care that the rice is gonna clump up. But if you're doing due diligence, you do want to make sure to rinse off that starch. Otherwise you're gonna get like bricks of rice as you like scoop it out of the rice cooker, because what's happening is that excess starch that's coating the rice is causing the rice to basically just clump up and solidify. So not the end of the world. You can absolutely just break it apart with a rice scoop. But if you are trying to make like the perfect bowl of rice, definitely give that stuff a rinse. And essentially what you want to do is rinse that rice until the water starts running clear. That means that you're not rinsing starch off anymore, you're just rinsing rice. And then cook your rice, and that will keep it from clumping up. Yeah. Is my wok vaccinated? I think I got this wok during COVID, actually. No, I don't think so, actually. I think I got it at like the start of COVID. Yeah. All right. So just like with our first batch, we're giving this a rotation to make sure that that oil coats our steak. And then give it a nice toss. Almost. So once again, if you're trying to get that wok, what we're trying to do is get that oil to ignite. It almost caught on fire, but not quite. Also not that important, so if you're not really super intending to try and catch your wok on fire, you don't have to do that. But essentially what we're trying to do in order to capture that wok is I'm tipping my wok forward, and then as I tip it forward, that oil, you see the oil is starting to collect at the bottom of the wok closer to the tip. And then what's happening over here is that's the open flame. So if we get it close enough, that oil will eventually catch on fire. So not super important, also kind of dangerous. So if you're scared, you can absolutely skip that step. Yeah. From an Asian Australian. Oh yeah, Asian Australian. Hello from Australia. What is chow fun? Yeah, so chow fun. So the dish that we're cooking today is called beef chow fun. I believe it is just colloquially referred to beef chow fun, as beef chow fun at least. At least here in the States, you'll see it on menus as referred to beef chow fun. What it's talking about when you see the word chow fun is actually specifically referring to the type of noodle. And chow fun is specifically a type of wide, flat rice noodle, which is what we are just finished pulling apart. Looks like this. Here's our fresh chow fun. It has very, very thin qualities to it, and it's really, really delicate. So that is what you will see That's what you will see menus referring to anytime that you're cooking fresh chow fun. It is not referring to just the dish. That's also why you'll see that word tossed around so frequently. But in Chinese cuisine, though, you will see it referred to as beef chow fun because I believe it is just referring to the two things that are in the dish. Not a very inventive recipe. All right, here's our third and final batch. You will notice that I did not rinse the wok out. This time we are going to try and save that fond. And we're, again, doing the exact same thing, being careful not to burn ourselves. Ow. If we were smart, we would probably be using tongs, but I'm not. It's fine. And just like with our first two batches, I'm laying it flat side down, making sure the largest amount of surface area as possible is making contact with the hot surface of the wok. And that's going to give us the best possible chance at developing the most possible sear. So obviously, because not all of the steak is making contact with the wok, that also means that not all of it is actually going to sear. That's totally fine. It's not the end of the world. But we do want to maximize the amount of crispiness that we get from our steak, so we're adding it with the largest surface area facing downward. That's also the same reason why you won't see me just dumping the steak into the wok and then trying to sear it, because then we're not really going to have control over what part of the steak is making contact with the wok. We want to add that one piece at a time so that we're very, very conscious and aware of which part of the steak is hitting that hot oil, which part is touching the hot surface of the wok, and so on. Yeah. Real Joe Bag of Donuts. Yes. I love reading the usernames. Yeah, tips on tenderizing the beef. Yeah, so we actually ran through that earlier, but that's totally fine. We can talk about it again. So what essentially, there are a couple of my favorite techniques that come up in this recipe. In the original recipe, what we did is we approached the steak the way that you would approach a Mongolian beef, which is essentially coating the steak in a layer of cornstarch, sort of like a breading almost. And that cornstarch, what's going to happen once you go and sear the steak is the first thing that sears is the cornstarch. And then the second thing that will sear is the steak. So when you bite into a piece of Mongolian beef, if you've ever had Mongolian beef, very, very popular stir fry, what you're biting into, the thing that's crispy, it's not just the steak. The thing that's crispy is also the seared cornstarch. So that the original recipe that I had done, it does exactly that, and that's what we did, is essentially borrow that technique from Mongolian beef, which we can also link. Here's that recipe. And that, essentially that helps us keep our steak nice and tender because the thing that's searing is cornstarch, not the steak. So that we, underneath that nice crispy layer of cornstarch is a really, really tender piece of steak. What we're doing today is I actually skipped that step in lieu of another technique that I've also gotten really, really fond of. And it's a technique that you'll see come up in a lot of Chinese cooking, which is called Velveteen. And essentially what we did was we added a quarter teaspoon, or about a half a teaspoon of baking soda, dissolved that in water, and then added that to our marinade and let that sit for about 20-30 minutes. And what that's doing is essentially preventing the proteins in our steak from bonding as we sear. And that kind of keeps our steak nice and tender, almost like it's a really, really fatty piece of steak. But in fact, it is not fatty at all. We're using flank steak, which is very, very lean. It has every right to be very chewy. And as far as I have come across, that's in my experience, the best possible way of getting to a very, very tender piece of steak is that velveting technique. If you're really committed, you could do both things. You could do the velveting and then add a layer of cornstarch. That might even be even better. I just skipped that cornstarch step because I didn't feel like doing it today because I was lazy. Yeah. Ooh, do I get enough heat from home stovetop compared to burners in restaurants? Yeah. So yeah, lots of people ask me about that. Is it a problem since we're cooking on a home range? So what Lucky Dinosaur is referring to is that when you're cooking on a home range, the amount of heat that comes out of your home range is much, much lower than the heat that comes out of both restaurant burners and wok burners. So a wok burner essentially is designed to mimic the kind of heat that you would get from a commercial range. Those commercial ranges, so the wok burners that we use in the food booths, in the pop-ups, I think they have 200 BTUs. And this standard home range, like the one that I'm cooking on right now, I think it clocks in at like 30,000 BTUs. I think maybe even less than that. So essentially what we're trying to do when we're cooking on a home range is compensate for the fact that we don't have those same quality of BTUs. So we don't have as much heat. It doesn't mean that you can't cook in a wok, it just means that you have to cook very, very differently. So the main thing that you do is the process that we've been doing for the last like almost 20 minutes now, is the reason that I didn't sear all of the steak at once. So you'll notice that the steak, the wok clearly has enough space to sear all of our steak at once. But we're not doing it all at once. And the reason for that is because if we were to try and do that, you would end up cooking on a really, really underheated wok. So by adding our steak to our wok a little bit at a time and keeping that wok relatively empty, that makes sure that our wok stays nice and hot, or hot enough to cook in it. So essentially what you will see this referred to as batch cooking. We're basically trying to keep that wok nice and hot for as long as humanly possible. Eventually it is going to start overloading, but the only point in time where everything is going to be in our wok at once is going to be at the very, very end. That's how we keep our wok nice and hot. Yeah. All right. That ought to do it. So the last thing that I'm going to do before we got all of this nice fond going on here, so this is a technique that definitely comes from Western cooking. You'll notice at the bottom of my wok there's a whole bunch of fond that's building up, and that's all like residual steak fat, a little bit of like burnt sugar, a little bit of that marinade, all of that good stuff. We want to save all of that as much as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm adding my sauce base here, and then we're going to deglaze things a little bit. I also like to add a little bit of water. So we're going to deglaze all of this nice fond from our wok. I also added, that was about a quarter cup of water. And that's just to compensate for the fact that our sauce is going to start reducing here. Yeah. All right, that's looking good. This bowl is feeling small. I feel like I'm gonna miss. Get a bigger bowl. So I'm switching to a larger bowl, and then we're pouring out our sauce, which is now deglazed with all of that good fat and all of that good stuff that's living in our sauce now. So here's our finished sauce. It is nice and thick and juicy. We got lots of fake steak fat going on in there. That's all that good stuff that we want to try and save. And then last up, I'm rinsing out my wok one more time, and then we're going to reheat this thing, and we're going to start cooking our stir fry. So at this point, you will also notice that the remainder of everything that I'm going to cook today is going to happen in like 5 minutes. So the rest of the things that we're cooking are going to happen in like, no kidding, like probably like 5 minutes, maybe even less than that. So you'll notice that we have been streaming for almost 45 minutes now. The rest of our stream is going to happen in like 5 minutes, maybe 5-10 minutes. And the reason for that is because once we start wok stir fry, everything is going to happen really, really quickly. And that's why it's very, very important that once we get to this stage, everything has got to be done already. So we already separated our noodles, we finished our sauce, all of the ginger and garlic and the bok choy has all been chopped, everything. All of that stuff is done already, so we don't want to be fucking with any of that anymore. We want to be finished doing that so that we can focus on getting that stir fry timed correctly, because at this point, when we're cooking on really, really high heat, everything has to happen almost on a like a very, very like coordinated, like choreographed schedule, because it's happening so quickly. Things will start burning if you don't time things correctly. So when you get to this point, you want to make sure that everything is already done. So don't be fussing around with anything else at this point. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Hello to everyone just tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST. With new recipes out over on my YouTube channel every Friday. So if you have not checked out the YouTube channel yet, that's the YouTube channel that's living at the bottom of the screen if you're watching on Reddit. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the channel you're already on. Over there, that's where we've got all of our new recipes out. Those are out every Friday. So tomorrow coming up is going to be a recipe for a string bean chicken, which is one of my new favorite stir fries right now because I love string beans. So that's coming up this Friday. That's part of a series that we've been doing that's essentially deconstructing a lot of foods that come from Panda Express and other like similar Chinese, like Americanized Chinese food. And kind of taking a look at what those dishes would look like if we were to reassemble them in the context of like more traditional or like more authentic Chinese wok frying techniques. And that sort of like taking a look at what those dishes actually look like from that perspective, which is always really interesting with dishes that are like stir fries, because stir fries are like can be anything. A lot of the time those recipes end up being very interesting because a lot of those things come just straight up from American food. So like the General Tso's chicken, very interesting because essentially what we're trying to do is turn an American dish into a Chinese dish, which is weird. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely hop over to the YouTube channel. Check out what's going on over there. We got into a lot of fun stuff coming up. We're also working our way up to 4,500 subs by the end of the month, so if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. Feed him Charo. He's very hungry. All right, so now our wok is nice and smoky and hot. I'm adding, that's 4 tablespoons of peanut oil. We're going to give this a good long yao, which is essentially coating that wok in cold oil. Get a little bit more oil here. And that's going to give us our nice non-stick surface. Very, very important. You don't want that oil in the wok while the wok is heating up, because that's going to get you a very, very sticky wok surface. Then going in first, that's my ginger and my garlic. And then we're going to bloom these until they're fragrant. That's usually, for me, about 10 seconds. But I like to say use your nose at this point. When you start smelling ginger and garlic, that's when you know you're doing things right. At this point, this is also why I also say I love cooking in a round bottom wok. It's because we can pull up all of this oil down here and bloom our aromatics in that oil. You wouldn't really be able to do that in a flat bottom wok because you would have a lot more trouble getting that oil to aggregate. There's my bok choy going into the wok. We're giving this a good toss. And then I'm going to let this bok choy go for about a minute, maybe 2 minutes. The main thing that I'm looking for in this bok choy right now is I'm trying to let some of those leaves wilt. And that's got a little bit more volume than I'd like. So we're trying to wilt some of those leaves. We're also trying to just more generally cook off a little bit of that rawness and bite that we're going to come across in that bok choy. So I'd like to let it be a little bit more tender, but not like, we don't want like fully sauteed and like cooked bok choy. We want these to be mostly raw. So like what I like to say is just past the raw stage. So they're still crispy, but nice and tender at the same time. Bok choy, yeah, that's essentially it. I see the word bok choy spelled in all kinds of weird ways. And I don't think I've ever seen it actually spelled the way that pinyin, the pinyin is actually spelled. I see it usually B-A-K. C-H-O-Y, which is not correct. Weird. But yes, Whiskey Trance, yeah, to answer your question, yeah, it is bok choy. What we're using today is baby bok choy, though. yeah, Whiskey Trance, yeah, bok choy. Second, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make funny. I just thought it's funny. I like seeing the way weird ways that Chinese words are spelled in English, which is always super funny and really interesting to me. Because there's a lot of like sounds that come up in Chinese that's like not things that are meant to be said in English, almost like the umlaut, which is really funny and interesting. But yes, that is bok choy. Today we're cooking with baby bok choy, which is my favorite type of bok choy. It's a little bit more tender and a little bit more sweet than full-grown bok choy. That's also why it's a little bit more pale and white, rather than full-grown bok choy, which is more of like a jade green color. is also, I believe, the reason why jade is good luck in Chinese like culture. I think because it's the color of bok choy. Also, everything in Chinese culture is good luck, but who knows? All right, so there's my steak going in. Hey, there's Hamcharo. That's Hamcharo, everyone. Hamcharo is the hamster that eats ramen. He only gets to eat when somebody feeds him, so please subscribe on YouTube, or else he gets very hungry. So I just added my beef to the wok, and then I'm adding that's a handful of chow fun, and then we're going to very gradually let things combine here. You will also start noticing that I'm not going to do any more aggressive wok tossing anymore. So all of my tossing from this point onward is going to be very, very gentle. And essentially what we're trying to do at this point is be very careful not to break up, or our best possible effort to not break up those nice, long, luxurious strands of chow fun. Because we just spent a long time trying our very best to make sure that we preserve these strands. If you were watching at the beginning, you will know that I spent a good 5 minutes pulling this chow fun apart, so we don't want to mess that up by tossing the wok too aggressively at this point. So I'm very, very gently just using my spatula to get to the bottom, and then we're doing a real gentle scoop. I'm also adding that's like about a handful at a time, and also very gradually adding sauce base to the wok as well, and just giving it a real gentle toss. This is also, by the way, at this point, if we were cooking Thai food, this is the point where we would start adding egg to the wok, and that's how we develop that nice like egg-coated noodle that you will be familiar with from like most Thai noodle stir fries. So things like pad Thai, pad see stuff like that. It comes from egg. And this is the point where we would add that. So I always say, or I have always thought of chow fun, beef chow fun, as basically like Chinese pad Thai, basically, which I always thought was really interesting. All right. Ooh, can you use bok choy for salads? You absolutely can. Bok choy is a really versatile veggie because it's so leafy and it has those nice greens on it. You can also dice it up really finely and use it in basically any context that you would use diced cabbage for. So one of my favorites is I have used it in the filling of dumplings. It's really nice to add to dumplings. Kind of has that same texture of cabbage, but it has a little bit more flavor. You could use it in ramen. It's a really versatile veggie. You could use it in all kinds of contexts. How is the noodle that we're using spelled? Yeah, so you will generally see it spelled as chow fun. I have seen it spelled many different ways though, and I actually don't know what it's referring to when you see the word chow fun. Because the word for noodle in Chinese is mian, which is not related. All right. All right, that's gonna do it for us. Stop and taste it. Oh yeah, that's nice. So super important, this is especially important anytime that we're working with anything based in dark soy sauce. You will notice that I did not use all of the sauce. There's a good like almost a whole quarter cup of sauce in there that I didn't end up using. So that's really important, especially with anything that's working with dark soy sauce, because you can absolutely over-season things if you use too much of that. So don't be concerned if you find that you're not using all of that sauce base. Depending on like how reduced it is, or how much noodle that you cooked, or how much steak that you cooked, you may or may not end up using all of it. Not the end of the world if you don't use all of it. In my case today, I think the reason that we didn't use all of it is because we were rendering a sauce based off of that fond, and we ended up getting a little bit more juice and fond out of that than I had originally expected. All right, so the last thing that we want to do anytime that we're cooking in carbon steel is give that wok a good rinse. So it is not like when you're working with, say, like Teflon, for example. Teflon has a quality about it where it will absolutely crack if you start rinsing your Teflon while the Teflon is hot. We generally don't want to do that when we're working with Teflon. Carbon steel is different in this case because it won't crack. You're not going to be in danger of like warping the wok or anything. And what's going to happen is it's a lot easier to clean while it's hot because the surface of the wok is still got that nice non-stick quality to it. So what I like to do is give it a good solid rinse. I actually did a little bit of scrubbing because some of that chow fun was sticking. And then usually what I'll do is I'll give it a good wipe down. And then not every time, but every like 3 or 4 times, I'll probably give it a little bit of coating of oil. And that's just going to keep things from oxidizing. We don't, most importantly when you're working with something that's made out of carbon steel, is that we don't want to leave any moisture going on here. So our wok is nice and dry and basically ready to cook on again. Don't leave any moisture sitting in your wok because you're going to get into the world of starting to oxidize that wok. And that's when you see things start to rust, which is never a good thing. All right, plate this up. Yeah, what do I use to clean it? Yeah, so I usually what I'll do is I'll do most of our scraping in the wok. So what I like to do is do my best effort to get all of that stuff off using the cooking utensil only. And if you've done things correctly and have not burned anything, almost everything should come off either with that cooking scrape or sometimes with a little bit of pressurized water. And then most of the time, that usually like 80% of the time everything comes off when I do that. In today's case, because we were searing, not everything came off. So what I did end up using was a little bit of steel wool and then just gave it a really quick once over. It's not going to scratch. I don't know why people are so concerned about scraping off. I don't know what you're thinking. You're worried about scraping off on carbon steel. It's not going to scratch. You're not going to scrape anything off. The worst case, what's going to happen is you might scrape off a little bit of your seasoning, but that's not the end of the world. So ideally what you want to do is never have to scrub it, because if you never scrub it, then that seasoning will just keep building forever. That's obviously never going to happen because eventually you're going to mess something up and you will have to scrub your wok, which is not the end of the world. Don't be concerned if you have to scrub your wok, but I like to do my best effort to make sure that I don't have to scrub that wok as much as possible. But if you do, yeah, a little bit of steel wool, and that'll do the trick. Yeah, cleaning process is pretty similar to a cast iron pan. Yeah. Same for seasoning. Essentially, what you're doing is adding a little bit of oil. That oil is basically keeping things from carbonizing or oxidizing. Carbonizing. Basically, what we're trying to do is prevent that carbon steel from starting to rust. So when you do that in a cast iron skillet, you're doing the exact same thing. We're basically trying to keep that cast iron from starting to rust. That's basically the only way that you can damage cast iron. It's also pretty much, well, not the only way, but when you're working with cast iron, it's really the main way that you're going to end up damaging your cast iron. Unless you like slam it on the pavement or something, really the only way that you can mess up cast iron is if you let it rust. And that's like the one of like the biggest tragedies anytime I see like a really expensive cast iron that's sitting on the street that's got like a significant amount of rust damage, is because that's like the one problem that you will ever come across. Otherwise, cast iron is basically like indestructible because it's cast iron. Even when that does happen, though, you can absolutely scrape that rust off. It takes a lot of work because you got to put a lot of elbow grease in. But if you do the work, you can absolutely rescue a really, really expensive cast iron that you found on the street, which I have friends that have done. But it's a real pain in the ass. You got to scrub for a long time. Yeah, acrobatic bike. Yeah, how's it going? Do I make these recipes on days that I'm not streaming? Sometimes, not super often. Because we're streaming so often, usually if there's something that I want to eat, I'll probably do it on a day that I'm streaming. Most of the time when I do cook things that are in a wok and I'm not streaming, it's probably because I'm recording something. So if you're watching a YouTube video, that YouTube video was probably, not always, but almost always filmed on like a Friday or Saturday or sometimes a Wednesday. One of the days where I'm not streaming, and that's usually the reason that I do it that day, is so that I can focus on recording it and not basically not fucking up because I mess up when I stream a lot because I'm talking. Yeah. Don't want to oversalt with soy sauce. Yeah, you can absolutely oversalt with soy sauce. That's generally like fringe class. That's generally why I recommend being very careful when you're working with dark soy sauce, because it's so concentrated that like if you use too much of it, especially even in like a sauce base, it can be misleading because it looks like you're not adding that much sauce. But you've got to remember that that stuff is super concentrated, especially if you reduce it like we just did with ours. That makes it even more concentrated, so you can absolutely go overboard on that stuff really quickly. It's also for the same reason why I like using low sodium soy sauce. Because it's a little bit less concentrated than full, like the red cap kikkoman, which is going to be like really, really salty and like really, really concentrated, which makes it really easy to overdo it. So I do have a little bit of red cap soy sauce, or red cap kikkoman with me, but I usually leave it. It's just for like table serving. So like when I'm eating dumplings or something, I'll use sodium soy sauce, specifically for that reason that I can course correct and like adjust with salt, maybe adjust with something else that's really salty. That I don't want to, like, so that I don't have to be like bound to how much salt is in that soy sauce. So what about the dope beats? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so if you're looking for the music, that all lives on my second channel, which is at Woo Cooks Beats. Find it. There it is. There's the Woo Cooks Beats YouTube channel. That's where all of the music lives too, so if you're looking for all of that, that's a good place to stop by. Thank you for asking. Those are mostly like a lot of remixes. There's a couple of original tunes up there now too. A lot of just like lo-fi hip-hop stuff that I've been doing during quarantine, so those all live over there. Yeah, let's taste this. Oh yeah. That steak is super tender, but also like nice and crispy, and like well seared, and also just like really moist, and like just got a lot of like moisture and fat locked in. But really, I think that key is that baking soda and that velveting technique, and that's what's making it so tender. And if I didn't know better, I would kind of just assume that this was a much fattier piece of steak. Maybe like a New York strip, or kind of almost has the texture of like a really nice cut of filet mignon, because it's really, really tender because of that baking soda. So anytime that I'm working with a cheap cut of meat, I always recommend using that velveting technique, because it's going to help keep things nice and tender, even though you're working with a really, really lean cut of steak, or like if you're working with like a say like a pork chop, or even like a top round like steak. Or any kind of piece of meat that's like really, really chewy and tough, that velveting technique is going to help quite a bit. Yeah. Hey, Growl. Yeah, thanks, man. Thank you. Cool. It looks like just like your house. Okay. Cool. Thanks, everyone. I know for sure that I missed some questions, so let me know. The chat, the RPAN chat is very short. It's only like, I think it's only like 10, 15 lines. So if I'm not facing the laptop and I miss stuff a lot. So let me know if you have any questions. Feel free and repeat yourself. Don't feel bad about repeating stuff. I know I miss stuff all the time. So I'll be here doing dishes. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be here hanging out. Also, I'm going to spin some tunes from the Woo Cooks Beats channel, so you can check out what those actually sound like with the singing and stuff going on. So, as always, we're streaming every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST, with new recipes out over on the YouTube channel every Friday. So this Friday, as in the one tomorrow, coming up is going to be our green bean or string bean chicken, depending on who you ask. Could be string bean or could be green bean. I found that there's a weird history behind string bean and green bean, which I didn't know about. So that recipe is coming out this Friday. Tomorrow, probably around like 9 PST or so. Depends how early I wake up. Let's see. That recipe is a part of a larger series that we've been doing, where I've been getting into like deconstructing a lot of really, really classic Americanized Chinese food So things like General Tso's chicken and like Kung Pao chicken, honey sesame chicken, things like that, and sort of taking a look at what those dishes look like if they weren't so Americanized. So a lot of times those end up coming from the Panda Express menu, which is where our string bean chicken is coming from, and that's going to be sort of like this way of how I've been like kind of taking apart Chinese food and then reassembling it in the lens of like how you would traditionally see wok fries done, which is always really interesting to do with a really Americanized dish, because a lot of times those dishes, they're not Chinese at all, they're basically just American food, so that's always really fun. So also really fun to do with stir fries like what we're doing tomorrow, because stir fries are really adaptable and can be interpreted in many different ways. So that's coming up tomorrow. What else? We're doing Friday after that is going to be larb. So we're going to do the larb guy, which is from the probably most commonly known from Spider-Man now. What else? After that, I forget what's coming up after that. At some point, we're going to be doing a fan tuan, which is a Chinese rice roll. Stuff like that. Lots of stuff like that coming up over on the YouTube channel. So if you haven't made your way over to the YouTube channel yet, definitely hop over and check out what's going on over there. Lots of fun new stuff coming up. We're working our way up to 4,500 subs by the end of the month. So if you want to help hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and give it a subscribe. Panda is like the most Americanized version of this. Yeah, that's what makes it so fun though, is that if you like kind of take a look at what's like the most Americanized version of a dish and then reproduce it, but remove, figure out what those American version things are. Usually for me, that ends up being a lot of sugar and just generally like a lot of salt and like sauce. And then remove all of those things and replace them with things that come from American food or come from traditional wok frying, which is really interesting, especially in a dish like string bean chicken, because that string bean chicken is a very common wok fry that comes up in a lot of Chinese food, a lot of like traditional Chinese food too. I've been eating string bean chicken since I was a little kid, so that's really interesting, because essentially what we're doing is kind of taking a look at this really American dish and taking a look at like what are the things that you can do in order to reproduce this dish as if it were traditional wok frying. Also really interesting with that like really Americanized stuff like General Tso's chicken, because when you do something like General Tso's chicken, essentially what you're trying to do is cook American fried chicken, but also do it like with some kind of like traditional wok fry, which is really interesting. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, that honestly is probably like the most fun series to do. It's also really fun to like kind of like pay homage to a lot. We also do another series where I've been reproducing a lot of foods that come from like basically all of my favorite Chinese restaurants here in Oakland, and that's been really fun because we've been paying a lot of homage to basically every place that I've eaten food over the last 10 years. So lots of stuff like that coming up over on the YouTube channel. So if you want to find your way over and give us a subscribe, we're working our way up to 4,500 subs by the end of the month. So cool. All right, thanks everyone. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be here doing dishes, and otherwise we will be back. Let's see, on YouTube we're going to be back tomorrow with the new recipe for string bean chicken, and then we'll be back streaming on Monday, the 19th. Yeah, Monday the 19th. And we're going to be cooking through that recipe live. So we're going to be cooking string bean chicken, start to finish here on stream. All right, thanks everyone. I'll see you soon. Bye.
If you think that you don't know, never mind, that you still don't love yourself, no. You can find it from somebody else, no. Everybody's got to grow up sometime. Funny how we shoot the move, still will we fight it, baby. Alright, never mind. Yes, I found it now. I'm falling in love with love, and it's bringing me down. everybody wants to be different. I still got dreams, but they don't love me like they used to love it. And I'm reminded of how bad I used to want it. And yes, I still got dreams, but more like a junkie of my 20s, and it's breaking me down. Want to be, baby, yes I do you want to be?
You're as sweet as strawberry wine. You're bad. Whoa, glass of brandy, darling, I'll stay. Stone on your love all the time.
little baby girl is in need. Am I coming out of left field? Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. I've been feeling it since 1966 now. Might be over now, but I feel it still. Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. Let me kick it like it's 1986 now. Might be over now, but I feel it still. Got another mouth to feed. Leave it with the babysitter, mama call the grave digger. Gone with the falling leaves. Am I coming out of left field? Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. I've been feeling it since 1966 now. Might have had your fill, I feel it still. Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. Let me kick it like it's 1986 now. Might be over now, I can feel it still. We can fight a war for peace. Give in to that easy living, goodbye to my hopes and dreams. Stop flipping for my enemies. We could wait until the walls come down. It's time to give a little to the kids in the middle, but oh, until it falls, won't bother me. I'm a rebel just for kicks. Yeah, your love is in the bitch for my heart to eclipse. Might be over now, but I feel it still. I'm a rebel just for kicks now. Let me kick it like it's 1986 now. Might be over now, but I feel it still. Might have had your fill, I can feel it still.
Gọi là bản năng, nhưng mà ít có bao giờ được nói và mọi người biết đó là nền tảng của ta hết. Nhưng mà nói cái đó cho nên Bồ Tát là thường được gọi là nội bí hoặc ngoại hiện. Vậy ai có một Bồ Tát nào là nhân? Ở bên trong đó thì ta giấu chính cái thực tích của chúng ta càng nhiều chừng nào càng tốt chừng nào. Còn ở bên ngoài đó thì người ta sao cũng vậy thôi. Nó mình có chứng tỏ hơn cả. Mình tập không có gì. Cái người mà thành công thì cái người ở bên trong đó thì không thể thành công. Nhưng mà bên ngoài đó là ta sống bình thường với họ để họ thấy ta cũng bình thường.